The wealthiest organization in human history was founded by a man who said wealth was a spiritual obstacle. The most powerful institution in medieval Europe was built on the back of a religion whose central teaching was humility and poverty. How did that happen? And what does it tell us about every powerful institution that has come since? Welcome back. Today we're talking about the Catholic Church at the height of its power and about the Crusades, which were not a story of faith, but a story of an institution fighting for its survival. Let's start with what made the Church powerful in the first place. An emperor, a king, a warlord, these figures can threaten you with death. That's frightening. But death is finite. You die, it's over. The Catholic Church had something far more terrifying: eternity. If the Church decided you were a heretic, not just someone who sinned, but someone who refused to accept the Church's authority after being corrected, you were excommunicated. Cut off from the community of Christians, and cut off by the Church's reckoning from any hope of heaven, you would burn in hell, not for a year, not for 1,000 years, forever. Even kings were afraid of this. When Pope Gregory VII excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in 1076, Henry walked barefoot through the snow to Italy in the middle of winter to beg forgiveness. The most powerful secular ruler in Europe, humiliated because the threat of eternal damnation was more frightening than any army. This is why the Church could accumulate what it accumulated. At its height, the Catholic Church controlled roughly 1/3 of all the land in Christian Europe and paid no taxes on it. It collected tithes from peasants already ground down by feudal obligations. It sold indulgences, essentially cash payments that would reduce your time in purgatory. It sold positions in the clergy to wealthy men regardless of any spiritual qualification. It sold relics, many of them fakes, promising divine power to whoever bought them. And all of this ran on the same fuel, the terror of what happens after you die, controlled exclusively by one institution. But by the year 1000, cracks were forming, and they were forming on 5 fronts simultaneously. First, Jerusalem was in Muslim hands. If the Church was the true representative of God on earth, why was the holiest city in Christianity controlled by Islam? That was embarrassing. Second, Muslim Spain, the region Europeans called Al-Andalus, was visibly wealthier, more tolerant, and more sophisticated than Christian Europe. Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived and worked together there. The Church couldn't explain why God's enemies seemed to be doing better than God's people. Third, the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople had formally split from Rome in 1054, creating a rival claimant to true Christianity. Fourth, the internal corruption was becoming impossible to ignore. Priests with wives and children, bishops appointed by kings, bishops who had simply bought their positions. Fifth, and perhaps most dangerous, ordinary people wanted a direct relationship with God. They didn't want to go through priests and bishops and cardinals. The Church's entire power rested on being the only middleman between humanity and heaven, and people were beginning to question whether that middleman was necessary. Facing all 5 crises at once, the Church did what every institution does when its legitimacy is threatened. It went on offense. It scapegoated. It took the resentment of peasants who were being exploited by the nobility and redirected it toward the Jews, who had been forced by the system to serve the nobility as tax collectors and bankers, making them visible targets for rage that had a much more powerful source. This was not a coincidence. It was a structural feature. Scapegoating a visible minority is always cheaper than addressing the actual source of people's suffering. It persecuted. The Inquisition developed mechanisms for identifying and silencing internal dissent. Heresy, defined not as theological disagreement but as refusal to submit to church authority, became a crime punishable by burning at the stake. The goal was not justice. The goal was maintaining the appearance of unanimity. And it crusaded. In 1095, Pope Urban II called the First Crusade, a military campaign to retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. Thousands responded. Why? Because the Church offered something extraordinary. If you died on crusade, your sins were forgiven entirely. You bypassed purgatory. You went straight to heaven. In a world where the terror of eternal punishment was the foundation of social control, this was the most powerful promise imaginable. It turned the Church's greatest weapon, fear of death, into a recruitment tool. Here's the turning point. The Crusades did not ultimately save the Church's power. They revealed its limits. After 200 years and multiple campaigns, Jerusalem remained contested. The military failures made the Church look less like God's invincible representative and more like a political actor that lost wars. And the questions that had been suppressed. Why do we need priests who talk to God? Why is the Church richer than the kings it claims to serve? Why does buying forgiveness work? Kept coming back. Eventually, they would produce a man named Martin Luther who would nail his questions to a church door and begin the process of breaking the monopoly. The playbook, scapegoating, persecution, crusading didn't disappear when the church's power faded. It got inherited by every political institution that followed. The names changed, the fuel is the same.